Welcome to another quiet moment in history that somehow got recorded. Picture this: you're settling into your straw mattress on the evening of January 5th, 1709, somewhere in the sprawling countryside of Europe. The air feels crisp, but not unusual for winter. Maybe a bit of frost on the windowsill, nothing your wool blanket can't handle. You pull your covers up to your chin, listening to the familiar sounds of your village, settling into sleep. A dog barks in the distance. Someone's shutters creak in the gentle breeze. Your breath forms small puffs in the chilly air, but hey, it's January. What did you expect? What you definitely didn't expect was to wake up in what would become known as the most devastating winter in half a millennium. You probably won't survive this. Statistically speaking, hundreds of thousands of your fellow Europeans won't make it through the next year, and that's just counting the ones who kept decent records. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from as we journey back through these quiet moments together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You have no idea what's coming. There's no weather app on your primitive smartphone because, well, smartphones won't exist for another 3 centuries. And even if they did, meteorologists in 1709 wouldn't have seen this coming anyway. The temperature is about to plummet from comfortable winter weather to a bone-chilling -5 degrees Fahrenheit across the entire continent. That's the kind of cold that makes modern polar explorers think twice. But tonight, you're blissfully unaware. You're probably a farmer, maybe a blacksmith, possibly even a member of the minor nobility with your own small manor. It doesn't matter much. This particular disaster is remarkably democratic in its cruelty. You might be lying in a peasant's hovel or a merchant's comfortable bedroom, but come morning, you'll all be equally screwed. The thing is, climate catastrophes in the 18th century didn't come with the courtesy of a 5-day forecast. No cheerful meteorologist warning you to stock up on firewood and check on elderly neighbors. No emergency broadcasts or government preparedness campaigns. Just you, your family, maybe a few animals, and whatever food you've managed to store for winter, which, spoiler alert, won't be nearly enough. As you drift off to sleep, your biggest worry might be whether the chickens will lay enough eggs tomorrow, or if that persistent cough your youngest child has been nursing will finally clear up. You're certainly not thinking about the fact that tomorrow morning you'll wake up to find those same chickens frozen solid in their coop, their little feet literally stuck to the ground. Historians still argue whether there were any warning signs that contemporary Europeans might have noticed subtle shifts in wind patterns, unusual animal behavior, or changes in the color of the sunset. But if there were nobody thought to write them down, probably because they were too busy trying not to die from the dozen other ways 18th century life could kill you on any given Tuesday. The irony is almost poetic. You're about to experience what climate scientists would later call a black swan event, something so unprecedented and catastrophic that it reshapes entire societies. But right now, you're just trying to get a good night's sleep before another day of medieval drudgery. Sweet dreams, because when you wake up, the world will be a very different place. You wake up and immediately something feels wrong. Not the usual, oh great another day of feudal misery, wrong, but something deeper, more primal. The air in your room feels sharp against your face like breathing tiny needles. Your blanket, which felt perfectly adequate last night, now seems about as effective as a fishnet against Arctic wind. You pull it tighter around yourself, but the cold seems to seep through everything, the wool your clothes, your very skin. Then you notice the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a snow-covered morning, but the absolute dead silence of a world that has stopped moving. No birds chirping, no animals stirring. Even the wind seems to have frozen mid-breath. It's the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that makes you wonder if you've gone deaf overnight. You force yourself out of bed, your bare feet hitting the floor with a shock that shoots straight up your spine. The wooden planks feel like they're made of ice, and as you stumble toward your window, you can see your breath forming thick clouds in the air. This isn't normal winter morning breath. This is the kind of visible exhalation you'd expect from someone shouting in a snowstorm. Peering outside, you see a world transformed. Everything, and I mean everything, is covered in a thick blanket of snow that definitely wasn't there yesterday. The familiar landscape of your village has been erased, replaced by strange angular white shapes that might be houses, might be trees, might be abandoned carts. It's like someone took a giant eraser to reality and started over with a blank, frozen canvas. But here's the truly terrifying part. You can actually see the cold. Not just the snow, not just the ice forming on your window, but the air itself seems to shimmer with a crystalline quality that makes everything look slightly unreal. Modern science would tell you that you're seeing ice crystals suspended in the air, but right now it just looks like the world is breaking apart into tiny glittering fragments. You throw on whatever clothes you can find, wool stockings, leather boots, that heavy cloak your grandmother wove that always seemed unnecessarily bulky. Today it feels like wearing tissue paper. As you step outside, the cold hits you like a physical blow. It's not just cold, it's aggressive, invasive, the kind of temperature that makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe and turns your saliva thick and strange. The really unsettling part: your neighbors are starting to emerge from their homes too, and everyone has the same expression of bewildered terror. You're all looking around like you've woken up on an alien planet, which in a way you have. This is your village, your familiar little corner of Europe, but it's been transformed into something that belongs more in the far reaches of Siberia than anywhere people are supposed to live. Mrs. Hoffman from the house next door is standing in her doorway, wrapped in what looks like every blanket she owns, staring at her vegetable garden. What used to be neat rows of winter cabbages and turnips now looks like a graveyard of frozen lumps. You can't tell where her garden ends and the rest of the snow-covered ground begins. She catches your eye and shakes her head slowly, as if to say, "Well, we're all going to die, aren't we?" The wine barrel outside the tavern has split open its contents, frozen into a reddish-brown chunk that looks more like a bizarre sculpture than anything you'd ever want to drink. Even the town's well, which has never frozen completely, even in the hardest winters, is covered with a layer of ice so thick you could probably walk on it. Your livestock situation is about to become very clear, and it's not going to be good news. The chickens you were counting on for eggs are huddled in their coop, not moving, not making a sound. When you approach, you realize they're not huddling. They're frozen in place, their little bodies rigid, their eyes clouded over with ice. It's like someone turned them into grotesque poultry sculptures overnight. Historians still argue whether the temperature drop was truly as instantaneous as contemporary accounts suggest, but the psychological impact was undeniable. People went to sleep in one world and woke up in another. The livestock casualties alone would have been enough to destabilize rural economies across the continent, but that's assuming anyone had time to worry about economics when they were trying to figure out how to survive until noon. The first day of survival is mostly about denial and poor decision making. You keep thinking this has to be temporary. Surely by afternoon, the sun will break through and start melting this nightmare away. So you make the classic mistake of treating this like a normal winter day that just happens to be a bit colder than usual. You'll learn better, assuming you live long enough. Your first priority is obvious fire, but here's where things get medieval level complicated. The wood you so carefully stacked outside your cottage is now encased in a shell of ice, so thick you need an axe just to separate individual logs. And your axe, the metal is so cold it burns your hands even through leather gloves. Every swing sends shock waves of pain up your arms, and the wood doesn't so much split as shatter into frozen fragments that scatter across the snow like wooden shrapnel. Inside, you manage to coax a flame from your hearth, feeding it with furniture legs and anything else that will burn. But here's the cruel joke: the heat seems to disappear the moment it leaves the fireplace. You can be standing close enough to singe your front side while your back feels like it's being stabbed with icicles. The fire isn't warming your house, it's just creating a tiny bubble of not quite freezing air in a sea of Arctic misery. Your neighbors are making similarly desperate calculations. Old Henrik next door has started burning his wooden spoons and bowls, apparently deciding that eating with his hands is preferable to freezing to death. The blacksmith's wife is feeding her weaving loom into their forge piece by piece, the decorated wood her late mother carved disappearing into flames that barely seem to dent the cold. It's like watching people burn their own history just to buy a few more hours of life. The animals that haven't already frozen are in various stages of dying, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Your cow Brunhilde, who survived 3 previous winters without complaint, is standing in the barn shivering so violently you can hear her bones rattling. Her milk has frozen solid in her udder. Yes, that's apparently something that can happen, and it's exactly as disturbing as it sounds. The poor beast keeps looking at you with eyes that seem to say, "Fix this," but you can't even fix yourself. The pigs have it worse. Pigs, despite their reputation, are actually quite sensitive to cold, and yours have huddled together in a desperate pile that's slowly becoming a frozen pyramid of bacon. The irony isn't lost on you that you're surrounded by meat you can't access because everything is frozen solid, including the knives you'd need to butcher it. But the truly horrifying realization comes when you venture out to check on other families in your village. The Miller household is suspiciously quiet, and when you peer through their frost-covered window, you see them all still in their beds. Not sleeping, their lips are blue, their faces waxy and still. An entire family gone in one night, probably never even waking up to realize what was happening. This scene is repeating across your village, across your region, across the entire continent. People are dying faster than communities can process what's happening. There's no time for proper burial rituals, no time for grieving, no time for anything except the immediate, desperate scramble to not become the next frozen corpse. The village priest, Father Wilhelm, is trying to maintain some semblance of spiritual comfort, but even he seems rattled. His morning prayers are interrupted by chattering teeth, and the holy water in the church has frozen solid. He keeps muttering about biblical plagues and end times, which isn't exactly the morale boost your community needs right now, but you can't blame the man for being a bit existentially shaken. Food becomes a mathematical problem with no good solutions. Your winter stores were calculated for normal cold weather, not for whatever fresh hell this is. The root cellar, which should have stayed relatively warm, underground feels like a tomb. The potatoes have turned to rock-hard chunks, the preserved meats are frozen solid, and the barrel of grain might as well be filled with pebbles. Historians still argue whether communities could have done anything differently to prepare for such an extreme event, but the reality is that 18th century survival margins were already razor thin. This wasn't a matter of being caught unprepared. This was nature moving the goalposts so far that the game became unplayable. By evening, you're learning the terrible arithmetic of crisis survival. How long can you burn furniture before you run out of things to burn? How many calories can you survive on when every movement burns energy fighting the cold? How do you ration food that's become inedible anyway? These aren't questions anyone should have to answer, but here you are, making calculations that will determine whether you see next week. You might think that being rich in 1709 would give you some advantage in this frozen hellscape, but you'd be adorably wrong. The wealthy elite of Europe built their grand estates and sprawling palaces with one thing in mind: showing off. Practicality was for peasants. Insulation was for people who couldn't afford servants to constantly feed massive fireplaces. Those gorgeous floor-to-ceiling windows that looked so impressive in summer, they're now acting like portals to the ninth circle of hell. Take a stroll through any noble estate right now, and you'll witness the spectacular failure of conspicuous consumption. The Duke of wherever the hell has spent a fortune on Italian marble floors that are now so cold they're literally painful to walk on, even through thick-soled boots. His grand ballroom, designed to host hundreds of guests, has become a monument to architectural stupidity, a cavernous space impossible to heat, where the breath of anyone foolish enough to enter creates its own weather system. The really delicious irony, the servants' quarters. Those cramped little rooms, tucked away in the practical parts of the house, are actually warmer than the master bedrooms. The kitchen staff, huddled around their working hearths, are more comfortable than the lords and ladies shivering in their silk-draped four-poster beds. Social hierarchy has been temporarily inverted by the simple physics of heat distribution. At Versailles, the situation is particularly absurd. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, is discovering that all the gold leaf in the world can't make a room warm when it's designed more like a display case than a place where humans actually live. The Duchess of Orleans is literally sitting by a roaring fire, wrapped in furs with screens blocking the drafts, and she's still shivering so violently she can barely hold a pen to write about her misery. The palace's famous Hall of Mirrors has become a grotesque joke. Those 17 mirror-clad arches that usually dazzle visitors with reflected sunlight, they're now reflecting the desperate faces of courtiers who look like they're attending their own funeral. The mirrors themselves are frosted over, creating a distorted, nightmarish funhouse effect that makes everyone look like ghosts. But here's where it gets really entertaining. The rich are just as clueless about survival as everyone else, maybe more so. They're trying to solve hypothermia with the same logic they use for everything else, throwing money at it. The Count of something or other has ordered his servants to burn furniture from rooms he doesn't use, apparently not grasping that heat doesn't magically teleport from one wing of his mansion to another. The aristocracy's wine cellars, those temperature-controlled underground chambers that were supposed to preserve their precious vintages, have become frozen museums. Bottles of wine worth more than most people's annual income have cracked and shattered, their contents turned to burgundy-colored ice sculptures. The irony is exquisite. These nobles spent fortunes collecting liquid assets that have literally become solid liabilities. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff who actually know how to manage fires and preserve food are watching their masters make hilariously bad decisions. Lady Penelope has ordered her servants to heat her bedroom by bringing in braziers filled with burning coals, a strategy that's going to end in either carbon monoxide poisoning or a house fire, probably both. The servants are too polite to mention this, but they're quietly making escape plans. The fashion situation is equally ridiculous. These people have wardrobes full of silk, satin, and velvet fabrics that look gorgeous and feel absolutely useless against bone-deep cold. The ladies are piling on jewelry not for decoration, but because the metal accessories provide tiny additional layers. Meanwhile, the stable hands in their rough wool and leather are actually dressed appropriately for the weather. Historians still argue whether the Great Frost fundamentally changed European attitudes toward practical versus decorative architecture, but the immediate lesson was clear. You can't heat a cathedral-sized room with a decorative fireplace, no matter how ornate the mantelpiece. The really twisted part is that some nobles are starting to envy their own peasants. Those cramped, poorly ventilated cottages that look so depressing from the outside, they're actually easier to heat than grand halls. The peasants' habit of sharing living space with their animals, which seemed so crude and unsanitary, suddenly looks like brilliant survival strategy. By the end of the first week, class distinctions are becoming meaningless. Rich or poor, everyone's breath is visible, everyone's water is frozen, and everyone's looking at their surroundings with the same expression of betrayed disbelief. The only difference is that the wealthy are doing it in more expensive rooms. The truly surreal part of this frozen nightmare is that you can literally walk on water now, and not in the biblical sense. The rivers, lakes, and even parts of the sea have frozen solid enough to support your weight, creating highways where none existed before. It sounds magical until you realize you're only doing this because you're desperately searching for food, and the regular roads are buried under snowdrifts taller than your house. You strap on whatever you can find that resembles snowshoes, maybe some woven branches, maybe just extra layers of cloth wrapped around your boots, and venture out onto what used to be the Rhine River. The ice is thick enough that you can hear other people walking around down there, their footsteps echoing through the frozen water with an otherworldly hollow sound. It's like walking on the roof of an underwater cathedral. The Baltic Sea, which normally crashes against the coastline with enough force to reshape beaches, has become a vast white plain stretching to the horizon. You can walk from Denmark to Sweden without getting your feet wet, assuming you don't mind the risk of falling through a weak spot and disappearing forever into the black water below. Some brave or desperate souls are making this journey carrying whatever trade goods they can manage because the normal shipping routes are obviously out of commission. Amsterdam's famous canals have turned into frozen streets, and the Dutch are adapting with their typical practical ingenuity. They're using the ice as impromptu marketplaces, setting up stalls directly on the frozen water. You can buy whatever meager supplies are available while standing on what used to be a busy waterway. The merchants are calling it the winter market, trying to put a cheerful spin on what is essentially a desperation sale of whatever hasn't frozen solid yet. But here's the thing about walking on frozen water. It's absolutely terrifying. Every step sends vibrations through the ice, and you can sometimes hear it groaning and cracking beneath your feet. You're constantly aware that you're walking on a thin barrier between solid ground and drowning in freezing water. The ice looks solid, but ice is a liar. It can look perfectly safe, right up until the moment it dumps you into water, so cold it stops your heart before you can even scream. The really eerie part is finding things trapped in the ice. Fish frozen mid-swim, their eyes wide and startled looking, suspended in crystal clear ice like exhibits in some nightmare museum. Occasionally, you spot larger shapes of deer that tried to cross the river, a cart that broke through earlier in the winter, sometimes things you'd rather not think about too carefully. Switzerland's pristine mountain lakes have become massive ice rinks, but nobody's skating for fun. The Swiss are using them as highways to transport whatever food they can find from one village to another. You might see a line of people trudging across what used to be Lake Geneva, looking like a caravan of refugees crossing a white desert. The hot springs in Germany, those natural thermal features that were supposed to be impossible to freeze, are solid ice. Think about that for a moment. Water that bubbles up from deep underground at temperatures hot enough to cook an egg is now frozen solid. It's like nature decided to suspend the basic laws of physics just to make this winter extra impossible. Some enterprising souls are trying to fish through the ice chopping holes and dropping lines into the black water below. But the fish, assuming any are still alive down there, aren't biting. They're probably huddled at the very bottom of whatever bodies of water haven't frozen completely through, in a state of fish hypothermia that makes them about as active as underwater statues. You meet other desperate wanderers on these frozen highways, families carrying bundles of whatever they could salvage, lone travelers who've given up on their home villages, children who look like they haven't eaten in days. Everyone moves slowly, conserving energy breathing, creating clouds that trail behind them like visible desperation. Historians still argue whether the social implications of these frozen waterways created new trade routes or simply highlighted how isolated European communities really were, but the immediate effect was clear geography had been temporarily rewritten, and people were walking where ships used to sail. The most unsettling part is the silence. Water, even when it's not moving, much creates subtle sounds, lapping, gurgling the gentle noise of life. Frozen water is completely quiet, creating a landscape that feels dead in the most literal sense. You're walking through a world where one of the most fundamental sounds of life has been erased. Just when you think you've figured out how to survive this frozen hellscape, March arrives with the cruelest joke, yet false hope. The temperature starts to climb just enough to make you believe the nightmare might be ending. You feel that first hint of warmth on your face, see the first tiny drip of meltwater from your roof, and your heart does a little leap of joy. Finally, spring is coming to rescue you from this Arctic prison. You're adorably naive. What you don't realize is that this is just the first of 6 more brutal cold snaps that will continue through what should have been spring. Mother Nature apparently decided that one catastrophic freeze wasn't enough. She's going for the full seasonal devastation package. Every time the temperature rises just enough to give you hope, it plunges back down like a sadistic yo-yo designed by someone who really doesn't like humans. These repeated freezes create a psychological torture that's almost worse than the original shock. At least in January, you were dealing with the unknown. Now, you're experiencing the crushing disappointment of hope, repeatedly dashed. You start to feel like you're trapped in some cosmic joke where spring keeps knocking on your door and then running away giggling. The ground, which briefly started to soften, freezes again harder than before. Any seeds you were optimistic enough to plant in the soil are now dead. The early spring vegetables that somehow survived the initial freeze get murdered by the return engagement. Your carefully planned agricultural timeline, the whole system that determines whether you eat or starve, has been completely obliterated. But here's where things get really creative in their awfulness. When the final thaw finally comes, it comes fast. All that accumulated snow and ice doesn't melt gradually like a normal spring. Instead, it turns into what can only be described as nature's revenge flood. The water has nowhere to go because the ground is still frozen solid underneath. So it just sits there, turning your world into a soggy, muddy mess that makes the frozen version look almost appealing. Rivers that have been solid highways for months suddenly become raging torrents, carrying chunks of ice the size of houses. Those same frozen waterways you've been walking on, they're now violent, unpredictable currents that can sweep away bridges, buildings, and anyone unlucky enough to be nearby when the ice breaks up. The sound is terrifying, a grinding, crashing roar as winter's infrastructure collapses all at once. Your village, which managed to survive the cold, now faces the delightful prospect of drowning. The main street becomes a river. Cellars that protected root vegetables from freezing are now underwater caverns. Houses that withstood months of snow loading are undermined by rushing water and start collapsing into the flood. The flooding reveals things you'd rather not see. All those animals and people who died during the freeze and couldn't be buried properly, they're now floating past your window in a ghoulish parade of winter casualties. It's like the earth is vomiting up all the death it swallowed during the cold months, creating a contaminated mess that threatens to poison what little drinking water you have left. Any crops that might have survived the repeated freezes are now drowned. The fields look like lakes, dotted with the occasional sad, waterlogged plant struggling to stay above the surface. Your agricultural year isn't just ruined, it's been completely erased and replaced with a swamp. The The really cruel irony is that you're surrounded by water but can't drink most of it. Floodwater is contaminated with everything it picked up on its destructive journey: animal waste, rotting vegetation, human sewage, and probably things you don't want to think about. So you're thirsty in the middle of an ocean of undrinkable water. Historians still argue whether the flooding caused more long-term damage than the freeze itself. But from your perspective, it doesn't matter. You're just trying to survive the latest installment in what feels like nature's ongoing war against human existence. The psychological impact is devastating. You've spent months learning to cope with cold developing strategies for staying warm, figuring out how to find food in a frozen wasteland. Now all those hard-won survival skills are useless, replaced by an entirely new set of challenges that require completely different solutions. It's like being forced to play a deadly game where someone keeps changing the rules just as you start to understand them. Village communities that manage to stick together through the worst of winter are now scattered by the floods. People are separated from their families, their homes, their stored supplies. Everything they managed to preserve through the freeze is now floating away downstream. The hunger starts as a gnawing discomfort in your belly, but by late spring, it's become a living thing that seems to have its own personality, demanding cruel and utterly indifferent to your suffering. You've moved beyond being hungry into a state that doesn't really have a good word for it. Your body is consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat reserves that were never meant to carry you through an apocalyptic winter followed by a flooded spring. Food has become more valuable than gold, more precious than family heirlooms, more sought after than salvation itself. That moldy bread crust you would have thrown to the pigs 6 months ago. Now it's a treasure worth fighting over. The sight of someone eating anything at all, creates a physical ache of longing so intense it's almost unbearable. You're witnessing the systematic collapse of human civilization, one empty stomach at a time. Social contracts that held communities together for generations are dissolving in the acid of desperate hunger. Neighbors who shared tools and helped with harvests are now eyeing each other's meager food stores with calculating glances. The priest who preached about charity and fellowship is hoarding communion wafers like they're made of platinum. The rebellion count in France alone tells the story 155 separate uprisings between February and June. That's not political revolution. That's mass starvation expressing itself in the only language it knows: violence. Starving people don't organize sophisticated political movements. They form desperate mobs that descend on anything that might contain food. Bakeries, granaries, noble estates, monasteries, anywhere that might have hidden stores becomes a target. You've seen things that will haunt whatever dreams you manage to have on your empty stomach. Families making decisions about which children are most likely to survive and quietly giving the others food portions to the stronger ones. Parents eating bark soup and telling their children it's a new recipe. Communities drawing lots to decide who gets the last of the grain stores, knowing that everyone else is essentially being sentenced to death. The cannibalism isn't talked about openly, but everyone knows it's happening. When the sister-in-law of the French king writes that children have devoured each other, she's not speaking metaphorically. Human meat becomes just another protein source when all the acceptable options have been exhausted. You try not to think too carefully about that stew your neighbor offered to share, or why the Peterson family suddenly has meat when no one else does. The black market economy that emerges is both fascinating and horrifying. A single egg might trade for a silver coin. A handful of grain could buy you someone's wedding ring. A preserved apple becomes currency more stable than any government-issued money. People are trading family treasures accumulated over generations for enough calories to survive another day. But here's the truly twisted part. Even the wealthy are starving. Those grand estates that looked so impressive in better times, they're just bigger buildings with the same empty pantries. Noble families who never learned practical skills like preserving food or managing livestock are discovering that titles and land holdings don't magically create sustenance when the agricultural system collapses. Scurvy starts appearing in populations that haven't seen it since maritime disasters. People's teeth are falling out. Their skin is developing mysterious bruises. Their wounds won't heal. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits is creating vitamin deficiencies that turn minor injuries into death sentences. Your body is literally falling apart from the inside due to malnutrition. The suicide rate skyrockets, but not in the way you might expect. People aren't killing themselves in dramatic gestures of despair. They're making quiet, practical decisions that they've simply run out of energy to continue fighting. When getting through another day requires more strength than you have left, stopping becomes a logical choice rather than an emotional one. Historians still argue whether the social upheaval caused by the famine created lasting changes in European political structures, but you're too hungry to care about long-term sociological implications. Your world has narrowed to a simple equation: find calories or die. The most heartbreaking part is watching communities that survived the freeze together slowly tear themselves apart over food. Villages that shared resources and supported each other through the worst of winter are now fragmenting into competing factions, each hoarding what little they have and viewing their former neighbors as potential threats to their survival. Children stop playing. There's no energy for games, no excess calories to waste on anything that isn't directly related to finding the next meal. Childhood effectively ends when society runs out of food to support it, while you're busy trying not to freeze to death in your little corner of Europe. Something historically momentous is happening up north that will reshape the continental balance of power for centuries. The Swedish army, 20,000 professional soldiers who were supposed to be among the most formidable fighting forces in the world, are dying in the snow faster than they can be replaced. This isn't a military defeat, it's a meteorological massacre. Picture this. You're a Swedish soldier following your young King Charles the Welgist on what was supposed to be a glorious campaign to crush Peter the Great's Russia once and for all. You've marched through Poland, won impressive victories, and you're feeling pretty confident about your prospects. Then January 6th arrives, and suddenly you're not fighting Russians anymore. You're fighting the weather itself, and the weather is winning. The Swedish military machine, which had been rolling across Eastern Europe like an unstoppable force, grinds to a halt, not because of enemy tactics or superior firepower, but because soldiers are literally freezing to death in their sleep. 2,000 men can die in a single night, not from battle wounds or disease, but from simple exposure to temperatures that make Siberian winters look tropical. You have to understand how psychologically devastating this is. These aren't peasant conscripts we're talking about. These are professional soldiers, men who've survived multiple campaigns, who know how to make camp in hostile territory, who've dealt with harsh winters before. They're equipped with the best cold weather gear 18th century military technology can provide. And they're dying anyway in numbers that make battlefield casualties look trivial. The supply situation becomes impossibly complex. How do you feed an army when the supply wagons can't move through snow drifts taller than the horses? How do you maintain equipment when the metal becomes so cold it burns bare skin? How do you treat wounded soldiers when your medical supplies have frozen solid and your surgeons can't feel their hands well enough to perform operations? King Charles the Begnust, who's barely 26 years old and has never faced anything like this, watches his invasion force evaporate in real time. This is a monarch who's won battles against experienced enemies, who's considered a military genius by contemporary standards, and he's completely helpless against an enemy that doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, and doesn't care about tactical brilliance. The really tragic irony is that many of these soldiers survive the worst of the cold only to face the Russians at the Battle of Poltava in a severely weakened state. They're malnourished, exhausted, demoralized, and reduced to a fraction of their original numbers. It's like showing up to a boxing match after spending 3 months in a torture chamber. Technically, you're still alive, but you're hardly in fighting condition. Peter the Great, meanwhile, is probably thanking whatever gods watch over Russian rulers for the most effective military ally he's ever had the weather. He doesn't need to outmaneuver the Swedish army. He just needs to wait for winter to do most of the work for him. It's the ultimate example of home field advantage, where home field includes meteorological conditions that can kill you. The Swedish defeat at Poltava isn't just a military loss. It's the end of Sweden's era as a major European power. The Great Northern War, which had been shaping up as a close contest between two ambitious monarchs, becomes a route that establishes Russia as the dominant force in Eastern Europe. And it all traces back to that January morning when 20,000 soldiers woke up to discover that nature had declared war on their invasion. Historians still argue whether Charles the Begnust could have made different strategic decisions that might have mitigated the weather's impact, but the reality is that no 18th century military was equipped to handle conditions this extreme. You can't tactical genius your way out of temperatures that kill people faster than you can count them. The long-term implications are staggering. Russia's rise to superpower status, the eventual creation of the Russian Empire, the complex balance of power that will dominate European politics for the next 2 centuries, all of it can be traced back to a winter that was so brutal it literally froze an army to death. From your perspective as a European civilian, you're witnessing the birth of a new geopolitical reality, assuming you survive long enough to see its consequences. The Great Frost didn't just kill people, it killed Sweden's imperial ambitions and birthed Russian dominance in a way that no amount of conventional warfare could have achieved. Just when you think you've survived the worst of it, the freeze, the floods, the famine, your body decides to present you with an entirely new collection of ways to die. The human immune system, it turns out, doesn't function particularly well when it's been weakened by months of cold malnutrition and psychological stress. You're about to discover that surviving the Great Frost was just the entry exam for an advanced course in 18th century medicine's complete inability to help you. Typhoid fever sweeps through communities like a microscopic army targeting people whose bodies are already pushed beyond their limits. You watch neighbors develop the telltale high fever, severe headaches, and characteristic rose-colored rash that marks them for death. The disease spreads through contaminated water, which is basically all the water. Now, thanks to the flooding mixing human waste with drinking supplies, and there's absolutely nothing anyone can do about it except watch people die and hope you're not next. Smallpox joins the party because apparently this year needed to be even more horrible. The disease that normally kills about 30% of its victims is now facing weakened populations where the mortality rate climbs much higher. You see children covered in the characteristic pustules, their small bodies burning with fever, their parents helpless to do anything except provide comfort while they wait to see if their offspring will live or die. Dysentery turns basic human functions into torture. The disease attacks your digestive system with a vengeance, causing severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and dehydration that your already malnourished body can't handle. People waste away in a matter of days, their bodies unable to retain what little nutrition they can find. The cruel irony is that you need water to fight dehydration, but the contaminated water supply is what's causing the disease in the first place. Scurvy makes its grand entrance because fresh fruits and vegetables have been unavailable for months. Your gums start bleeding, your teeth become loose, old wounds reopen spontaneously, and mysterious bruises appear all over your body. It's like your skeleton is slowly falling apart from the inside. The disease that plagued sailors on long ocean voyages is now ravaging entire continental populations who haven't seen fresh produce since before the freeze. Measles decides to get in on the action, spreading rapidly through communities where people are crowded together for warmth and protection. The disease hits children particularly hard, and with their immune systems already compromised by malnutrition, what should be a manageable childhood illness becomes a death sentence. Parents watch their children develop the characteristic rash and fever, knowing there's nothing they can do but pray and prepare for the worst. The really insidious part is how these diseases feed off each other. Someone weakened by typhoid becomes more susceptible to smallpox. A person recovering from dysentery has no resistance left to fight off measles. Scurvy prevents wounds from healing, making any injury a potential gateway for infection. Your body becomes a battlefield where multiple diseases compete to see which one gets to kill you first. Medical treatment in 1709 ranges from useless to actively harmful. The local barber surgeon might recommend bloodletting to treat your fever because obviously what you need when you're already weakened is to lose more blood. Herbal remedies that might have been helpful are unavailable because all the medicinal plants died in the freeze. Prayer becomes the most common prescription, which tells you everything you need to know about the state of contemporary medicine. The death toll becomes impossible to track accurately. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, especially since the ground is either frozen solid or flooded, making grave digging a nearly impossible task. Mass graves become the norm, with entire families buried together, in pits that look more like construction sites than proper cemeteries. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, but conservative estimates suggest that France alone lost about 600,000 people to the combined effects of the Great Frost and its aftermath. That's roughly 3% of the entire population dead in a single year. Imagine if 3 out of every 100 people you know simply didn't exist anymore by Christmas. The psychological impact is devastating. Survivors develop what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1709, it's just called being broken by life. People who live through this nightmare carry the trauma for the rest of their lives, constantly expecting the next disaster, never quite trusting that things won't suddenly get impossibly worse again. Children who survive grow up with a fundamentally different relationship to mortality than previous generations. Death stops being an abstract concept and becomes a constant familiar presence that could visit at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. Here you are sitting in the aftermath of one of history's most devastating natural disasters, and the most maddening part isn't the death toll or the economic collapse or even the geopolitical upheaval. It's the fact that nobody, not then, not now, not ever, can give you a satisfactory answer to the simple question, why did this happen? The scientists have theories. Oh boy, do they have theories. The most popular explanation involves something called the Maunder minimum, which sounds like a fancy coffee drink, but is actually a period when the sun decided to take a cosmic nap. Between 1645 and 1715, solar activity decreased significantly, with fewer sunspots and reduced energy output. The theory goes that less solar energy meant less ozone formation, which messed with atmospheric pressure systems, which disrupted the jet stream, which somehow created the perfect conditions for Europe to become a continent-sized freezer. It's a neat scientific explanation that makes everyone feel better about living in a universe that occasionally tries to kill entire populations for no apparent reason. The problem is that other climate scientists look at this theory and basically shrug. Georg Föllner from the Potsdam Institute suggests that changes in solar activity would only lower global temperatures by about 0.1 degrees Celsius, hardly enough to explain why wine was freezing in French cellars and the Baltic Sea turned into a highway. So we're back to square one, which is both frustrating and oddly comforting. At least you're not the only one who has no idea what just happened to you. Another theory points to volcanic eruptions that occurred between 1250 and 1300s, suggesting that massive amounts of debris in the atmosphere could have triggered a cooling period that lasted for centuries. 4 major volcanoes apparently filled the sky with so much ash and sulfur that sunlight was reflected away from Earth, causing temperatures to drop and ice caps to expand, which caused temperatures to drop even further in a feedback loop of planetary scale misery. But here's the thing about volcano-based explanations. They require you to believe that eruptions from 400 years earlier somehow culminated in one spectacularly bad winter in 1709. It's like blaming your current hangover on a beer you had in college. Theoretically possible, but the causal chain seems a bit stretched. The Norwegian researchers have perhaps the most honest theory of all. Sometimes climate just does weird stuff for no reason whatsoever. They call these events ugly ducklings because they don't fit normal patterns and seem completely wrong even when they're actually happening. Their research suggests that a massive section of Arctic sea ice spontaneously decided to migrate toward warmer waters, and kept doing so for about a century, disrupting ocean currents and atmospheric patterns in ways that nobody fully understands. This theory essentially boils down to climate is complicated and occasionally psychotic, which isn't particularly satisfying from a scientific perspective, but feels emotionally accurate if you've just lived through the winter from hell. The really unsettling part is that these solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, and random climate fluctuations are still happening. The sun goes through its 11-year activity cycles. Like clockwork, volcanoes continue to erupt and fill the atmosphere with debris, and ocean currents still occasionally decide to wander off in directions that make no apparent sense. We have better monitoring systems now, more sophisticated climate models, and early warning systems that would have seemed like magic to 18th century Europeans. But we're still fundamentally at the mercy of a planetary system that's bigger and more complex than human understanding can fully grasp. We can predict weather patterns days in advance and track long-term climate trends, but we can't prevent the sun from going quiet, or stop volcanoes from erupting, or convince Arctic ice to stay where it belongs. Historians still argue whether the Great Frost represents a unique historical anomaly or a warning about what natural climate systems are capable of when they decide to get creative. The honest answer is probably both. It was a once in 500 years event that killed hundreds of thousands of people and reshaped European politics, but it was also a reminder that humans live on a planet that doesn't particularly care about our survival plans. You've survived something that defied prediction, explanation, and preparation. You've witnessed the collapse and rebuilding of entire societies, watched nature rewrite the rules of what's possible, and learned that sometimes the most important historical events happen for reasons that nobody fully understands. The mystery isn't just academic curiosity, it's a fundamental reminder of how little control anyone really has over the forces that shape human history. Wind down. As you settle back into whatever passes for normal life, after surviving the impossible, remember that you've witnessed something that changed the course of history in ways both dramatic and subtle. The Great Frost of 1709 didn't just kill people and destroy economies, it reminded an entire continent that human civilization exists at the mercy of forces far beyond our understanding or control. The slow return to ordinary concerns feels almost surreal after months of existential crisis. You're learning to trust that tomorrow will come, that food will remain available, that the weather will behave within predictable bounds. But somewhere deep in your mind, you carry the knowledge that these assumptions can be shattered overnight by forces that don't negotiate, don't compromise, and don't care about human plans. The survivors of the Great Frost carry this wisdom forward, passing down stories that seem impossible to children who grow up in normal winters. They speak in hushed tones about the year when the world stopped making sense, when rivers became highways and wine turned to ice, when entire armies died not from battle but from breathing. Perhaps that's the most important legacy of 1709, not the political changes or the demographic shifts, but the reminder that we live in a universe capable of breathtaking beauty and casual brutality, often in the same moment. The sun rises on a world that looks peaceful and predictable, but underneath that surface, calm, vast forces continue their ancient dance, indifferent to human hopes and plans. Sleep well, knowing that you've survived something extraordinary. Dream of warm fires and full bellies of springs that arrive on schedule and winters that know their place. But remember, too, that history is written by those who endure the impossible and live to tell the tale. Rest now in the quiet spaces between storms where ordinary moments feel like miracles, and every dawn brings the simple gift of another day.